Today, we are making the Moonlight Dress. If you haven't yet got the pattern, I will pop a link down below where you can head to the pattern page and get the pattern. There is also any other info you might need and tester photos so you can see what the pattern looks like on different sizes and shapes. This video tutorial is designed to accompany the written instructions that come with the pattern, so please make sure that you read through those thoroughly before you dive in. There's a lot of extra details in there like sizing guides, fabric recommendations, intended fit. I know it can be tempting to skip this step and just dive straight into sewing, but I strongly suggest that you slow down, go through the instructions first, and then when you get to sewing, you can follow the video sew along. So if you haven't already done that part, feel free to pause here and take your time. This pattern was inspired by the ease and the comfort of vintage nightgowns, something you could just throw on and feel at home in. So whether you're new to sewing or you've been sewing for years, the inspiration of this project is to slow down and tune in and through the process, create something that you truly love. The Moonlight Dress comes in 4 different views. Today we'll be sewing view C and D, and through the process we'll be covering all of the views. So there is view A, which is a classic bodice with a softly squared neckline and button-down bodice. It also has gathers at the waist to add like a gentle volume to the skirt. There is view B, which is the clean and simple view of the dress. It features the same graceful neckline and soft gathers, but with a minimalist bodice. Then there is view C, which is like a romantic take on view A. So it has a gathered frill shoulder detailing that adds like a delicate touch to the button-down detail of view A. So then there is view D, which is a more playful take on view B. So it has like a soft gathered ruffle detail that goes around the neckline, the armholes, and the waist. And it's just a nice fun little touch on that simple plain bodice. If you're unsure on what fabric to use, there is fabric recommendations in the instructions. This fabric is designed to be soft and flowy and fall off the body, so it's designed for very lightweight woven fabrics. Today I'm sewing with a thrifted bedsheet. I love using recycled materials in my projects, and this one has a beautiful embroidered detail on the top, and it also had a lining underneath that matches perfectly that's plain. So I'm going with that today. I'll have a little box down below for you to be able to tell what view I'm sewing at each point, and timestamps in the description. So you can use those to skip forward to your relevant view. All right, it's time to begin sewing. So make a cup of tea, light a candle, settle in. There's no rush, take your time and enjoy the process. Right sides facing, attach the front bodice to the back bodice at the shoulder seam and repeat on the lining as well. Then press those seams open. Okay, so next we're going to stay stitch the neckline and the armholes 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the edge with a short 2 millimeter stitch length. As you're sewing the stay stitch, be very careful not to stretch your fabric as you sew. Just allow the machine to gently guide it through. When you get to the corner of your front bodice, so that we can get a perfect right angle there, we're just going to place our needle down into the fabric to keep it in place. Lift your presser foot and turn your bodice piece around so that you can then continue sewing in a straight line. Just make sure where your needle's sitting is that 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And just continue sewing. If you're adding a sweet little label to your dress, now is the time to add it. If you find the right side of your lining on the center back, you can just place your label on there and sew that in place. So far, everything we've sewn has been for all views. Now we start to separate into the different views. So I'll make sure it's here so you know what view I'm sewing at any moment, and check down below for a timestamp of where to jump to. For this view, we're sewing the gathered ruffles of view D. If you're sewing the other views, you can forward to the relevant timestamp. We're going to begin those ruffles with the armhole first. For our skirt front and back ruffle, we're just going to fold that in half lengthways, and then this will be set aside until step 12. The front and the back ruffle are slightly different lengths, so just be careful when you pop these aside to make sure they're marked correctly. We're going to take our 2 armhole ruffles and set our machines to the longest stitch length. Then we're going to sew a row of basting stitches 6mm or 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the ruffle, making sure you're leaving long tail threads at the start and end of your stitch so that we can gather them easily afterwards. Leaving a long tail thread at the end, snip that off, and then we're just going to sew a second row 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge again, so that we have even gathers when we're attaching it to our armhole. We're going to separate the tail threads from the top stitching to the underside, and we're going to take the 2 threads on the underside and just gently pull those, gathering the fabric as we go. You'll notice that your fabric begins to gather beautifully as you go. We want to make sure that those gathers fit our armhole as we're going, so I like to just pin the 2 edges. We're placing this onto our bodice piece, right side facing up, and we want it to fit evenly onto that shoulder piece. So sometimes it's good to pin those 2 edges as you go to make sure that you're gathering the right amount. Once that's in place, you can continue to pull those gather threads until it fits your armhole. Once the length of that feels right, you can tie off your ends. There are a few different ways to do this. You can tie a knot in those 2 threads that will prevent it from pulling out and loosening as you sew. The other option is to wrap it around your needle as a figure 8, and that will also hold it in place. This is always a good option too if you're not sure about the length of your gathers and you think you might need to change them later. Okay, once that's tied off, you can just move your gathers around until you feel like they're sitting evenly along the length of your binding. Once that feels good and your gathers feel like they're evenly spaced, I just like to pin it in place at a few points along the ruffle before giving it a nice little press just to hold those gathers in place. Just make sure you're pinning the raw edge of your binding to the raw edge of the armhole, and we have our right sides facing. Then we're going to sew that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Repeat those steps on the other armhole. Now we should be left with 2 beautifully gathered ruffles on both our shoulder seams. We're going to prepare our neckline ruffle by joining the 2 short ends right side facing and sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, then we're going to press that seam open, and with wrong sides facing, we're going to fold that in half along the length and press. And continue with this the whole way around your circle. Then we're going to set our machine to our longest stitch. We're going to sew a row of basting stitches 6mm or a 1/4 inch from the raw edge all the way around our neckline ruffle. Okay, Okay, and when we get back to that center point, we're going to ensure that we're leaving long tail threads again in order to gather. In order to make sure we get even gathers for our neckline ruffle, we're going to sew a second basting stitch 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch from that raw edge. And just making sure you have those long tail threads. You can sew that second row. Again, when you get to the end, leave those long tail threads, and that is ready to gather. Okay, we're going to take those two underside gathering stitches, separate them from the others, and begin gathering our neckline binding. So again, we just want to make sure that those gathers fit our neckline before we tie off the ends. You want to pin that at the center back, and then just check your ruffle as you go around to make sure it's the correct length to fit around your neckline. You can just curve it gently around these two squared corners at the front. And once you know that your neckline fits, you can tie off those two ends. When you feel like your gathers are evenly spaced, you can pin that in place. For this one, because we are going around a curve, I like to add a lot of pins just to hold that in place and make sure nothing moves. Again, we're just matching up those raw edges of our gathered binding and our bodice, right sides facing. Now that that is perfectly pinned in place with lots of pins, we're going to sew it with a 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch. Along the curved edge of my ruffle, I'm just going to finish that off by just folding it under 0.5 centimeters. It is so tiny, it's almost a rolled hem. We're just going to fold it over again by 0.5. Sew that finish in place, and then we're also going to pop a gathering stitch along the straight edge of our ruffles. Right, let's turn our machine up to 4. I'm going to turn up the tension and add a gathering stitch. I'm just going to pull out some long threads to gather with. Okay, and 5 millimeters from the edge, I'm just going to add that gather stitch. Okay, so one ruffle, let's do the other one. Now that we have our shoulder seams attached, we're going to attach our ruffle. So pin this in place, right sides facing, and then I'm going to pull these gathers tighter to fit that armhole within those marked notches. Now we're just going to pin that in place all the way along. Okay, so we're going to stitch all the way along the edge here with a 1 centimeter seam allowance to attach the ruffle. The following steps will be for all views. What we want to do is lay out our bodice main with the right side facing up, and we're going to take our lining and match it up with the right side facing down, like so. We're going to pin around our neckline, attaching our bodice main to our bodice lining, making sure that your shoulder seams are matched. Just pin your way around the bodice, matching the center back as well as the front seams. Once you've pinned the entire way around your neckline, making sure that your ruffle is tucked up inside if you were doing that view, we're then going to stitch with a 1 centimeter or a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When we get to the front corner of the neckline, we're going to do the same thing we did with the stay stitching, where we sew 1 centimeter past our corner. We're going to place our needle into the fabric to hold it in place, lift our foot, pivot, and continue sewing. And that will allow us to get that sharp corner. So we're going to cut in and grade all the way around our neckline so that there is less bulk when we fold it out. In order to get those sharp corners at the front, we need to clip into those corners. We want to clip directly into this corner here in order to get a sharp corner for our bodice front, but we don't want to clip through our seam. So just being very careful, cut in on an angle, making sure that you stop right before that seam. And then you will have a little snip there that will allow that to open up nicely. Continue grading your seam all the way around, making sure you're not cutting that seam allowance again, but just minimizing the bulk. Okay, and now we have a very small seam there. And what we want to do next, open up the lining of your front bodice, and you'll see the little frill here for this version. But for all views, you want to stay stitch this seam allowance to your lining here with a 3mm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, just to prevent it from rolling up while we're wearing it. And you can give that a nice little press if you like, just to secure it in place, and give it a stitch. So starting at one armhole with the right side of the main fabric facing down and the right side of the lining facing up, we're going to roll the main fabric over like a burrito all the way to the other side. Okay, when we get to the other side, we're going to flip that main fabric. So lift up our lining. We're going to flip that main fabric under and over. You're going to have the rest of your bodice tucked up inside and that seam on this side. And we're going to pin all the way around that armhole, making sure that our bodice, the rest of our bodice, stays tucked up inside and doesn't get caught in our seam. So grab your pins, and I like to start at my shoulder seams to make sure they match up perfectly. And my side seams. Okay, and what you'll have is a nice little burrito rolled up inside your bodice. So now we're going to stitch that seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch. Again, we're going to grade that seam allowance down to make it nice and neat. And once that's graded, we're going to pull the right side out through the shoulder channel. So you can open that up at the end and just simply pull that through. And you're left with a beautiful armhole that is nice and neat on both sides, and it looks just as pretty on the inside as it does on the outside. Okay, so we're going to repeat that same step on the other armhole. This is the armhole we've just finished, and this is our open armhole. So we're going to roll our finished armhole again, like a burrito, all the way to the other side. And then we're going to lift up our linings and flip that main seam under, main piece under and over, sandwiching in the other side. Again, just make sure our burrito is tucked up nice and neatly inside, not getting caught up in our seam. Matching up our shoulder seams, our side seams, and sew this side with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Again, we're going to trim this seam allowance down. And again, we're going to open that up and pull through the shoulder seam. Just like that, we have a beautifully finished bodice on both sides that looks just as nice on the inside. That looks just as nice on the inside as it does on the outside. Take that over to your ironing board and give those shoulder seams a good press. If you're doing the option with the frill or ruffle, make sure they're sitting nice. This is a good time to press those. At this point, if you like, you can also remove those basting stitches from your ruffle or frill. Once you've pressed your bodice so it's nice and neat, you have completed the burrito method. So it should be looking really nice and neat and even on both sides. And now if you are sewing views A and C with the button placket, this next step is for you. If you are doing views B or D, you can skip forward to the waist ties. So I'm going to add a button placket. The scary part is that we have to cut straight down the center of the front, but it works out fine. So trust the process. First off, we're going to attach our interfacing that you should have cut. On the bottom of your placket, you should have a half triangle, 2 full triangles and a half. And then for our interfacing, it's just the 2 triangles because it matches up in the center here with our 2 center triangles. I like to place another bit of fabric or a pressing cloth on top just to make sure that it doesn't stick to my iron. We end up with burnt stuff all over our iron. Hold it over it for just a few seconds so that it really adheres. Once our interfacing is attached, we're going to take the half triangles and fold them over to match into that full triangle. Should be about 0.5 centimeters the whole way up, and it should just, your folded edge should line up perfectly with that interfacing. Make sure that's sitting nice and flat, and what you're left with is the 2 triangles at the bottom, which we're going to then fold it over again, leaving you with 1 triangle. Press that down. We have our button placket. So we're just going to repeat that again on our other piece. In order to attach our button placket, we need to cut down our center front, which after all the work we've just done sounds very daunting. So what I like to do is fold it in half, making sure all our edges are matched up perfectly. So we have the true center front. I'm going to pop a pin in the corner here to make sure that it doesn't move around. And I'm going to give it a press so that we're catching our lining and our main fabric. And we're going to have those nice and flat. Okay. Now for the really daunting part, where we open this up, making sure that our lining and our main fabric are sitting super flat. All we're going to do is cut directly down that center front, allowing us to open it up. Okay, so how we attach this we're going to place our button placket on the right side, opening it up and opening up this side of our folded seam allowance, and we're going to pin that in place along our right edge. Matching up this bottom V. Going to stitch all the way down the edge of that interfacing on that pressed seam. Now that we have our stitch line down here, we're going to press that over. There we go. What we're going to do is finish this top edge first, and we're going to roll right sides together, the other side over, and we're just going to stitch directly along here, sealing in that top edge. So we're lining up our needle with the main bodice piece, and we're just going to stitch straight along there, and that just gives us a seam line that runs straight through. So when that folds back out, we're left with a really neat finish at the top on both sides. From the right side, top stitch the placket down 0.3 centimeters or 1/8 of an inch away from the placket edge on both sides. And what we're left with is this beautiful finish that's a bit more like a collared shirt than what we're used to with a lot of women's dresses, but I just really like the detail of it. So repeat this same step on the other side. Now that our button placket is done, we should have an under piece that our buttons will go on and a top placket that our buttonholes will go on. And your bodice should look like this. When it comes to attaching our buttons, I like to space mine 5 centimeters apart, and this will be different on each size range. So I'm making a 10, which means I need 4 buttons. I like to place one right at the top there, and then measuring from the center of the button 5 centimeters down, place a second button, and 5 centimeters from the center of that, I'm going to place a third button. Whoop. That went a bit high. And then 5 centimeters down again, we place our 4th button. So now that I have my spacing, I'm going to mark the buttonholes with a pin. Okay, let's swap our machine over to our button foot. We're going to place one of the buttons we're using in the back here, and then we pop this. And that is all of our buttonholes done. Going to pop some fray check on those and then open them up. Okay, so what we're going to do is actually secure the 2 button plackets together at the bottom. So we're going to sew a square 1 centimeter up. It's going to be 2 inches wide and 2 inches high. And then we're going to put a cross from corner to corner on the inside, and that will just hold the bottom of this together. Okay, so we just put 2 pins where my marks will go, and I start my stitch from that stitch line that we already have. And we just sew across till we reach the stitch line on the other side. From here we can pivot, stitching up that stitch line again until we reach our next pin. Okay, then again we pivot. And stitching. Back down, we have a perfect square. We're just going to go from the corner, I can find it, of our square to the other corner. And the same thing this way. with is this little square. I don't know if you can really see it here because it's white on white, but it is a little square here with a cross going through it, and this just secures it a bit more, especially if you're breastfeeding or something, and it just stops it from coming open and ripping off the skirt. We're going to sew one of the short ends of our waist tie closed and then pivot and stitch along the length of the tie with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So starting from the folded side, we're going to stitch to the raw edge along that short end, stopping 1 centimeter before the end. And then we're going to pop our needle into the fabric, lift our presser foot and turn our waist tie so that we're sewing down the length now. Place your presser foot back down and continue sewing. Once we've trimmed down the seam allowance on those waist ties, we're going to turn them right side out. You can use whatever method you prefer. I just have a chopstick that I like to use and fold it over the end of the chopstick and then feed it through. I find a chopstick good because it has a bit of a blunt end and doesn't pierce through the end of whatever I'm turning out. You can use that to just poke out those corners and make sure they're nice and firm. You get those beautiful, nice, sharp right angles, like so. And then remove your chopstick or loop turner, whatever you're using, and simply pull it through until you're done. We're going to attach our waist ties to the side seams of our front main bodice and only to that piece. So you should have marked the notches for your waist tie when you're cutting out your bodice. If you didn't, the bottom of the waist tie sits 1.5 centimeters up from the bottom on the side. So raw edge to raw edge, just pin that in place. And I like to have my waist tie seam at the bottom. Now I have my back main and my right main facing, and only those two pieces. We're going to pin them together, making sure that our waist tie sits nice and neat and isn't caught up in that seam. When we get to the seam where our main joins our lining, we're going to pin that seam perfectly together. If you're doing view D and you have that frill sitting there, we're going to pin the frill to the lining side. And this will allow it to sit nice and neat under our arm when we're wearing it. And then we are going to continue along, connecting those two lining pieces. What you should be left with is your front main and back main facing, and your front lining and your back lining facing. And they should be lined up perfectly at that seam. And your waist tie, if you're doing it, should be tucked up neatly inside. So we're going to sew the entire way along there, so you get one nice long finished seam with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat the same step on the other side, so joining your two main pieces and your two back pieces and stitching the length of that seam. Just open up those seams and give them a nice press so that they stay nice and flat on the body. Because all these seams are enclosed inside the bodice, they don't need to be finished with any kind of overlocker. If you're doing view D with the ruffle, you will have sewn your ruffle to the lining side. When you press this out, we're just going to press those two ruffle pieces up into a nice V here, and so it sits nice and flat when you're wearing it. And I found this just the best method to keep it in place. It should look like this on the right side. So you'll have a little V underneath, and it prevents it from just rolling down as you're wearing it and keeps these nice and neat. Okay, to secure these two bodice pieces together, we're going to stitch in the ditch, which is within this seam, down the side here, 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches, just to secure those two pieces together and stop them moving around when you're wearing it. But it will still leave this bottom section open so we can attach our skirt later on. Once that is nicely pressed and sitting flat, we're going to stitch in the ditch here, and we're going to only go down 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. I'm just going to mark mine with a pin. You could use a pen or chalk, whatever you prefer. And we're just going to stitch straight down that line there inside the seam to secure those two bodice pieces together and make sure they don't move around when we wear it. But we don't want to secure the bottom bit because we will be sewing our skirt to these separate pieces. We are almost there. So it is time to prepare our skirt for our bodice. So this dress does come with pockets. It is up to you whether you want to attach them. We're going to begin with the front of our main skirt, right side facing up. When you were cutting out your pattern, you should have marked notches for where your pockets go. Okay, so with our skirt facing right side up and our pocket facing right side down, we're going to match our pocket and skirt at those notches that we made when we were cutting out our pattern pieces. Just pin that in place. And then we're going to sew this in place with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once we've sewn that pocket in place, we're going to turn that pocket away from this dress and just press that seam flat so that the seam allowance is towards the pocket. And we're going to understitch just directly next to that seam to secure the pocket and stop it from rolling out as we wear it. Now that we've completed the pocket on the front piece, we're going to do the same thing again on the back skirt. With the right sides facing, we're going to place our skirt main front onto our back main front. We're going to sew down the side seam around the pocket bag and continue down to the bottom. We're going to finish off those edges so they don't fray, so you can either use an overlocker if you have one. If not, you can simply do a zigzag stitch on your domestic sewing machine and that will just seal it in and stop it from fraying. When we're doing our main skirt, we are going to follow the same line that we stitched going around our pocket bag. As we're using an overlocker that has a blade on it, we do want to be careful. So what we're going to do is overlock down to this point. So we're going to fold this bit up, giving us a bit more of a straight line here. So straight down as opposed to trying to pivot around the pocket, which risks cutting into it with our blade. Okay, and as we get to the other side of the pocket bag, same thing. Instead of trying to curve, we're going to take this piece, fold it up to give us a bit more of a straight line here. And then we're just going to continue to sew straight down. And just to show you what you finish up with this technique is it's a nice smooth overlock. There's no like lost stitches, not catching the fabric. It's a much neater finish. Now that we've attached the front and back of our main skirt pieces, we're going to connect our lining pieces, the front and back. Right side's facing. We don't have to worry about the pockets on the lining, so you can just sew straight down the side. So we're going to sew that with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This next step is for view D. So we're going to attach our waist ruffle before we gather our skirt for our bodice. To connect our waist ruffles together, we're going to join the front and back pieces at the sides with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. To attach the waist ruffle, we have our skirt main right side facing up And we're going to do our raw edge to raw edge, attaching that waist ruffle. Just pin it at the center front there to begin. Make sure you've marked that point. And our ruffle should be the exact same width of our skirt. So we simply want to follow that line. You'll notice the front ruffle is different to the back. It's slightly longer to allow for this curve. So make sure you've got the front ruffle at the front and the back ruffle at the back. And you should be able to connect the 4 points. So your center front, center back, and your sides. This ruffle piece will gather with the skirt when we do our gathering stitches before we attach it to the bodice. We're going to sew that in place with a 0.5 or 3/16 of an inch seam allowance. Once it's attached to the bodice, it will leave us with a ruffle exposed of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. But for now, we're just basting it in place. We are now back to all views, and it's time to gather our skirt. With this skirt, because we have the curved V at the front, we're going to break up our gathering stitches. We'll still do 2 rows to get those nice even gathers, but we're going to do 1 set on the back of the skirt, and then on the front, we're actually going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches either side of that center front, just to allow for ease of gathering over that curve. We're going to start with our main skirt, and we're going to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the back of the skirt. So set your machine into its longest stitch length. All right, so this is how it will look at your center front. You should have a gap here that is about 1.5, and then your 2 different rows of gathering stitches. You're going to take the 2 top threads and just gently pull on those together. Okay, and you will end up with a nice little gentle gather the whole way along. Your ruffle will be gathered with your skirt, so it's going to be easier to gather if you don't have this ruffle, but it's very cute if you do. So repeat that on the other side of your V and on the back of the skirt, and we're just going to make sure that that matches up widthwise with our bodice. Once you have your gathering stitches done, we're actually going to trim in at that center front V. So we're going to trim in only 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch. Now we don't want to cut through our gathering stitches. We want to make sure we're only going in that 6 millimeters, right at that center V where you already have your notch. And that will allow it to kind of open up a little bit when we connect it to the bodice. Now that our skirt is gathered, we're going to attach our bodice. So this will be different for view B and D to view A and C. So I'll begin with view B and D, which is the version without any button placket, because we're going to attach our skirt main to our bodice main and our skirt lining to our bodice lining for this version. We're going to place our bodice inside our skirt, right sides facing. Now we only want to pin to the main piece of our bodice, not the lining. So if you get the main piece of your bodice, separate it from your lining, and just at the side seams, we're going to connect those, making sure they line up, and just make sure that your waist tie, if you did it, is tucked up inside. Place a pin right at that side seam there, and do the same on the other side. Again, making sure we only have that outside layer of our bodice and the lining is sitting separately. And your tie is out of the way. We're going to connect the other side seam. And then you can always find your center back main piece. You should have a notch on your bodice, and we're just going to match up the center backs there. Again, we're just doing the main bodice and not the lining. Then we're going to take our center front, and now we have that V in the bodice. Take our main bodice with that V there, the V of our main bodice and the V of our skirt. I'm going to match those up, but what we're going to do is open up that V on the skirt here that we just trimmed out. I'm going to pin that in place there, allowing it to sit open. Once you have those 4 points pinned, you can move your gathers around, either make them tighter or looser till it matches the bodice pieces. And just pin it in place. Once you're happy with those gathers and they're all pinned in place nicely, you can tie off your tail ends of your gathers. So you can either do the 8 around your pin, or you can tie it in a knot. There we go, and then just continue with the back and the other side of the front. Once you've attached that skirt main to the bodice, you can finish that edge with an overlocker or just with a zigzag stitch on your domestic sewing machine. And then we're just going to repeat the exact same thing on the skirt lining. So do your gather stitches, gather in place with the bodice lining, stitch it in place and finish with the overlocker. You can then remove any visible basting stitches from the skirt and see how it looks finished. Now that you've overlocked those edges and removed your basting stitches, you should be left with a beautiful waistline. And give all of that a press. If you have ruffles, make sure you're pressing those ruffles into place. And how sweet is that finish? If your sewing views A or C with the button placket, then this next step is for you. Pin the main skirt to the main side of the bodice, right sides facing. Starting with the sides, center back and center front, pull the thread tails to tighten the gathers until the skirt fits the bodice. Okay. Then, pin the lining skirt to the lining side of the bodice, right sides facing, starting with the sides, center back and center front. Pull the thread tails to tighten the gathers until the skirt fits the bodice. You should now have 4 layers that line up to sew through. So you'll have your skirt main, bodice lining and skirt lining all together and pinned in place. Make sure you pin around the entirety of that, making sure you're securing the gathering placement and preventing anything from being able to move. At this point, you can press the waistline gathers down to help them stay uniform. Then we're going to sew through all 4 of those layers with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The stitch line should sew directly between our gather stitches, allowing our gathers to stay even. Once that's done, you can finish those edges with an overlock or just with a zigzag stitch on your domestic sewing machine. And how sweet is that? So you should have a beautifully finished waistline there with a nice V at the front, and should be all pressed and beautiful on the front and back. I just love this finish with the view D. Okay, our last step is to finish our hemline and then we're done. So we're going to do our main skirt first. We're going to fold up the hem of the main skirt by 0.5 centimeters or 3/16 of an inch. And we're going to press that. Then we're going to fold it again by another 0.5 centimeters or 3/16 of an inch and press again. And then we're going to stitch that hem in place on the main skirt. Once the hem of our main skirt is done, we're going to move to the lining. And for our lining, we're going to fold the hem of the lining up by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and press. And then we're going to fold it again by another centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and press again. And then we're going to stitch this in place. Congratulations, you have finished your moonlight dress. I hope you feel as proud of yours as I do of mine. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me. If you'd like to share your make, I would love it if you could tag me at sustainably.gabrielle or use the hashtag SGMoonlightDress and we can cheer each other on together. If this tutorial has brought a little bit of calm or beauty to your day, I would really appreciate it if you would like or comment, tell me about your process, or subscribe. It helps me create more heartfelt, slow living projects like this one. Until next time, keep creating gently and take care of your beautiful self.